behaviour. And I want to start with a question, if that's okay. And as we go through this, please put stuff in the chat. And Shona, if there's something in there, if someone asks a question, you want me to stop, just shout it out and we can have a debate and I'll come off share. I've got a few slides, guys, if that's okay. And one of the things that I want to do is just work through three really different perspectives and show how that's combined to give me my sense of how this works for me and the sort of stuff I do with schools. So as I said, I work with trauma-informed schools, and with them, it's very much about understanding attachment, understanding trauma awareness and being informed, understanding what happens for some young people who don't grow up in a home that's really supportive and nurturing. And for that perspective to give us an insight into how children are becoming more and more complex and some of the reasons that might be. I do some work with Paul Dix. So a lot of the work in that team is about relational approaches to behaviour. So I'm just going to share some ideas and some thoughts on some really practical elements of that. And the other bit really is thinking about, you know, how do you put that in practice then, pace of change? Because one of the things that Shona was talking about is not rushing into it. And I know schools that are trying to find the answer, they're trying to find the solution. And I've worked with local authorities that have commissioned training, and those trainers have gone in, and then it hasn't happened overnight. And then they commission someone else and they commission some more training, and it hasn't happened overnight. So I've got a question for you, if that's okay. And if you look on Twitter and you look at what's going on with debates around behaviour, it's really polarised. It's massively, massively polarised. And on the one hand, you've got people who are saying all behaviour is a choice. And on the other hand, you've got people who are saying all behaviour is a communication of unmet need. And I think to start with, I'd really like you to, if we think about a scale of 1 to 5, so 1 is all behaviour is a choice, and 5 is all behaviour is a communication of unmet need. Could you put a number in the chat and let us know where you are on that position? And there's no right answer, by the way. There is no right answer. So what's your opinion on that scale? Where do you stand? Where are you? I can't see this. Oh, yes, I can. It's just appeared. Ash is 2.5. 3. James, I think it's dependent on an individual. Children, not one model fits all. 4. Stephanie. Okay. My opinion is I'm with Ash. I'm smack bang in the middle. I think it's sometimes a choice. I was thinking about those kids that locked me in that cupboard on my first day of teaching. That was definitely a choice. Let's wind up the new guy. I think that often behaviour is a communication of unmet need, particularly if we're talking about distressed young people who can't regulate themselves, who find it really difficult to regulate themselves. Very often anger in particular, something that triggers something in us. There's usually something else underneath anger as well. So if I had 2 feet, I'd have 1 in the all behaviour is a choice and 1 in all behaviour is communication of unmet need. In many ways, it's a daft question. And I've got another daft question for you as well. Same scale. Children need to be taught how to behave is a 1. And we need to see all behaviour through a trauma-informed lens is number 5. Where would you stand, guys, on that position? So 1 is children need to be taught how to behave, and 5 is we need to see all behaviour through a trauma-informed lens. Okay. Ash is number 1. 3, Steph. 1 with 5. Ash, and modelled, not just taught. Wow, absolutely brilliant. And again, it's a daft question, isn't it? And I think my personal view is that obviously children need to be taught how to behave. Because if we don't do that, we get chaos. But I also think it's really helpful to see behaviour through a lens that's trauma-informed, because not all behaviour is due to trauma, absolutely not. And it's the most overused and understood word, I think, in the lexicon. we say, I was on a train journey the other day coming back from London, and 3 trains broke down, and the bloke sitting next to me said, "This is bloody traumatic." And I said, "It's not, is it?" It's not traumatic. It's inconvenient, it's a pain in the neck, but it's absolutely not traumatic. But actually seeing behavior through a lens and trying to think what might be underneath it, what's going on with these young people. And just a bit of a slide from the work I do with Paul, and we talk about this a lot, that people have adopted what they assume to be a trauma-informed approach, and they say we're being nice, and it isn't working. These young people, we're being nice to them, we're trying to build relationships, and it's not having any impact whatsoever. And I think there's a real disparity and a real difference between an approach that's built on relationships and one that's built on relational practice. And this is sometimes something that's really, people might do a day on trauma-informed approaches, and they think, right, all we've got to do is be nice to kids, and all we've got to do is be kind to young people in order to make them feel safe. And they perhaps move away from an approach based on consequence and an approach based on consistency. And it'd be really interesting to get perspectives, because we've got a school in the room that have no rewards and no punishments. So it'd be really interesting to get that perspective. But I think if you think about relationships are intuitive, and they're sentimental, and they're variable depending on what mood we're in and who we're with, and they're based on emotion. But relational practice means getting underneath the hood of what's going on with young people. And relational practice is absolutely predictable, because I think that one of the things that we all need is safety. And the longer I do this, the more I think that it's about safety. It's about our safety. It's about the safety of young people. And our predictable, consistent adult behavior is the thing that gives that safety. It gives that routine. It gives that boundary. It gives that absolutely unbreakable consistency that children know where they stand, and it's systematic, and it becomes habitual. And I think that one of the things when we reflect on what relational practice means later on, it almost becomes infectious. And people look at this and they think, well, that's just airy-fairy nonsense. It's rubbish. And it really isn't. I think relational practice is built on routines, ways of doing things, safety, systematic, predictable ways of operating with young people so that they feel safe. It all comes down to safety. And I think that notion that we need to teach children how to behave, and as you've already said, we need to model it as well. Because if our behavior is different, if we expect young people to behave in a particular way, and then they see us behaving in a way that's counter to that, they look at that and they think, well, why should we bother? And that is particularly around school leadership as well. So if school leaders adopt an approach and they say to, the classic example is meet and greet, isn't it? I was working in a school in Somerset, and they were having real difficulty getting young people to lessons on time, and a lot of really problematic behavior in between lessons. They were taking a lot of time to get from A to B, 1,400 pupils moving across a massive site. And so we introduced a meet and greet protocol, and we asked every member of staff to stand outside the door and just notice the kids that were getting it right, and to greet them into the classrooms. And it was great for about 3 weeks, until one of the school leaders decided not to do it and not to bother. And everybody looked at him and they thought, well, he's not doing it, so I'm not going to bother. And that lack of consistency and that lack of role modeling from the senior team meant that fell away a little bit, and we had to pick that back up again and have some awkward conversations. I think going back to that definition, the word discipline has been almost bastardized. I think discipline is sometimes seen to be negative, and the root of the word discipline comes from Latin. It means pupil, it means instruction giving, it means teaching and learning and knowledge. And children need to be taught how to behave. Otherwise, we get this. My wife's an English teacher and a Senko, and she talks about this book a lot, and how if children are left to their own devices, we get absolute chaos. We have no rules, we have no routines, we have no ways of doing things, we have no consistency. And I think it again comes down to that lack of safety and lack of awareness of what's going on. One of the things that you're probably facing at the moment is children who are more and more challenging. I think every school that I go into report that even very young children now who used to be more malleable are more problematic. They're coming back at us with more and more challenging behaviour. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. Some of them are societal. I think the pandemic had a massive impact, but some of that was happening pre-pandemic as well. There was a statistic that came out recently from the NHS. I think it was 1 in 6 young people have a probable mental health disorder. And I think that statistic itself is problematic too, because my personal view is that we've removed the stigma around mental health, which is amazing. But what we've also done is in part pathologized and medicalized normal emotions. We've made it not okay to be sad. We've made it not okay to be angry. And I think that we're seeing that in our adults as well as our children. And one of the things I want to reflect with you now is on what healthy brain development looks like. And when I first started exploring this, it really helped me understand what goes on, what happens for some children who find other people, that lovely quote from John Bowlby, they'll either shrink from the world or they'll do battle with it. If they haven't got a secure attachment and they haven't had secure relationships in early childhood, they find it really, really difficult to trust and move into relationship with other people. And sometimes anger serves a really, really useful purpose for them. So you've probably seen this video clip before. It went viral 11 years ago. This is baby Emerson. So what's going to happen is mum is going to sneeze. And as mum sneezes, Emerson goes into a startle reflex and throws his arms out in the air. And then looks wide, his eyes go wide, and then mum starts to interact with him and Emerson starts to laugh and giggle. And I want you to watch this clip, and we're going to discuss it in a minute, but there's a reason for me showing this.
Baby. Baby. Does mommy's nose scare you when I blow it? Does that scare you when mommy blows her nose? Yeah?
There are a number of things happening in that clip. When babies are born, they've got roughly the same number of neural connections as adults. Neurons, sorry, about 100 billion. But the only bits that are connected are the brain stem and the limbic system. The rest of the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe, the really fancy bit at the front of our skull, isn't connected up yet. And what happens is that with relational experiences, with situations like that, where the baby gets startled and then mum reconnects, and when we pick up a baby and we soothe it and we nurture it and we calm it, what happens is connections are established between those lower, more primitive parts of the brain and the more sophisticated uppermost parts of the brain. And then what happens is we can access feel-good chemicals. So oxytocin in particular is a really amazing connection chemical. It's sometimes called a cuddle hormone. And when that happens, we produce oxytocin in relationships, and oxytocin stimulates the brain's natural endorphins, opioids, and dopamine. And so those chemicals buffer our stress response. So when we are stressed, our brains and bodies produce cortisol and adrenaline and noradrenaline. And what those feel-good chemicals do is they buffer that and they dampen that down. So that by the time Emerson is about 3 years of age, he's starting to form connections to his upstairs brain. And then he can begin to calm and soothe himself when things go wrong. So when bad stuff happens, Emerson can reach out to his prefrontal cortex, and his frontal cortex can dampen down that threat response. And what we know about healthy brain development is it's built from the bottom up, and it's built in relationship. So young people in my school, when I was the head of a PRU, they didn't have that. So they didn't have that healthy connection. They didn't have that healthy brain development. And they were constantly flipping their lid. They were constantly looking for threat when there is none, because threat can be either real or imagined. And young people who haven't had those key early attachment relationships find it much more problematic to access their frontal lobes. Now, one of the things that sometimes people confuse with this is those kids can't learn. They can. They obviously can learn. And people can overcome traumatic experiences. But the key bit is those neural connections. And Karen Treisman has a lovely phrase, and I love this clip. This comes from the work of Bruce Perry in the States. And Karen Treisman talks about the idea that every interaction is an intervention. And every time we connect with another human being on a social level, every time we validate how they feel, every time we empathize, every time we tune in, every time kid comes in the morning and you say, lovely to see you, mate, nice shoes, brilliant, nice haircut. You do that. You create those neural connections, those neural pathways in the brain are being wired up so that when a scary thing happens, when a bad thing happens, you can access the part of the brain that dampens that down and buffers that stress response and enables you to access those lovely upstairs brain chemicals. Now, for me, this was a real Damascus moment in trying to understand some of the really problematic young people that I dealt with, that they are operating from a different part of the brain. So what we need to do is to get them to access that upstairs part of the brain through relational practice. And a lot of that comes from safety. A lot of that comes from relational connection, but also through routine, through consistency of adult behavior. And if you're interested, there is some incredible research on a website called the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. I'll put the links in the chat later. But they're doing some fantastic work, free resources on this idea that brain architecture is built from the bottom up. So when children are very young, it's easier to reconnect those frontal lobes than it is when someone is in their 40s or 50s or 60s, but it's still possible. The amount of effort it requires to reconnect those frontal lobes and begin to trust and form solid attachment relationships needs more effort as you get older. So the brain's ability to change in response to experiences lessens as we get older, and the amount of effort increases as we get older, but it is still possible. And one of the other things that I remember years ago, I remember Bill Rogers, who was a behavior guru in the 90s, and he came to a school that I was working at in East London, and he drew a black dot on a sheet of paper, and he said, "What do you see?" And we all said, "The black dot." And he said, "Okay, we all see the black dot. That's our negativity bias. So as human beings, we look to the negative. It's an unconscious bias we all have. So if you have a lesson observation or an appraisal, and your appraiser says, these are the 10 things that you're doing absolutely brilliantly this year, but there's one thing that I'd like you to work on. The one thing is the bit we remember. Some young people have this. They have a massive negativity bias. They're looking at the world through a different lens. So for me, it's about how we reduce that negativity bias. This is something I find useful all the time. It's the window of tolerance. It's developed by Dan Siegel. If you're interested, he does a really nice video clip on this on YouTube. But the window of tolerance is where we can deal with situations. It's our sweet spot. It's how we can deal with the world. So when bad stuff happens, we dip in and out of our window of tolerance. We can go into this orange zone here. We can start to escalate. We can feel a little bit threatened. We can get a little bit more agitated, but we're still able to pull it back. We're still able to bring that frontal lobe back online, think our way out of it, think, I've been here before, don't do that, that's a daft thing to do. I can press the pause button in the brain. Or we might go into the green. We might start to get a little bit more flustered. This is me when my window of tolerance goes, when I'm tired, Like now at the end of term, when I'm quite exhausted, not as exhausted as you guys are, but I'm exhausted. I'm putting things off. I'm not doing that report. I'm getting a little bit more avoidant, but I know I can bring that back in. I can bring that back in to my window of tolerance. What happens with some young people, those that are finding the world and other people really challenging, they can go into hyperarousal, so they can go into the red or they can go into the blue. So hyperarousal is our sympathetic branch of our nervous system. It's our brain and body's accelerator. I want to get out of there. I feel really unsafe, so I'm going to run my way out of there, or I'm going to fight my way out of there. And at that point, your brain and body are flooded with cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline, and you can't access that amazing upstairs brain. Or you might go into disassociation. You might freeze or become really overwhelmed. And I don't know about you, but I've spent most of my teaching career focusing on the kids in the red, and I've missed the ones that are in the blue. And I've neglected those kids. And as they're older in primary school, the kids that do this, they're a little bit vacant, a little bit numb, a little bit robotic. They might be looking out the window, so we don't notice them. And then by the time they're 13, 14, they're the kids that are full of rage. And we're thinking, where did that come from? What happened there? And I find this diagram particularly really, really useful. And the other thing that I wonder sometimes is if we develop behavior systems that are based on zero tolerance, and if we just punish, and a lot of secondary schools in particular have a system of C1, C2, C3, you do this, there's a ladder of consequences. My view, and you can agree with me and disagree with me, and please do, is that all we're doing by doing that is we're putting sticking plasters on the knees of kids that keep falling over, instead of thinking why they're falling over in the first place. Getting underneath it, wondering what's going on for some of these young people. And it is not, absolutely not, pretending to be psychotherapists or trying to be psychologists and play armchair psychologist. It's absolutely not. It's just perhaps replicating what good enough parenting looks like and wondering what might have happened to that young person. And I found this on the internet and I really like it. And, behind those kids that are really, really angry are other emotions. Anger is always a secondary emotion. There's always something else underneath it. And for a lot of young people, particularly the ones that I dealt with over the years, anger served a really good purpose for them. It helped them. It pushed other people away. It got them what they wanted. It reinforced that notion about themselves that they're mad, bad, or weird, and that other people aren't to be trusted, that incoherent working model they might have about themselves. And I think looking underneath what's on the surface, for me, is really, really helpful. And that's difficult to do, as a class teacher of 30 pupils, when you've got 4 or 5 of them or 6 of them that are trying to do this. And this is why pastoral support is so important. And I think it's really upsetting sometimes that when the cuts come, and they have to, I know that when the cuts come, sometimes the first place to cut is pastoral support and SEN. And for me, that's where I've spent most of my career. I loved being a Senko. It was my favorite job ever. I think it just gave me a real insight into young people. When we don't get underneath what's going on and we just look at the surface and we just punish, we're not getting to the root of the issue. And I think there's a notion as well in terms of reframing our thinking, because we live in a world of diagnosis and categorization. ADHD diagnosis is going through the roof with adults as well as young people. There was a Panorama documentary, I don't know whether you saw it recently, where a guy went undercover and he had a 3-hour interview with an NHS clinical psychologist, and they said, you haven't got ADHD. And then he went to a private clinic and he had a 10-minute online consultation. And they told him after that 10-minute consultation that he had ADHD and he could be prescribed Ritalin. And I am not saying for one second that ADHD doesn't exist. I think it absolutely does. But I think very often there's something underneath it as well. And it is not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. One of the things that influenced me in my thinking more than anything is the ACEs study. And originally it was done in the States. It was done in 1998. And a physician called Vincent Felitti was working in an obesity clinic. And he was doing big high-end surgeries like gastric band surgery, stomach reductions, big stuff. And there was a core of his patients that just weren't losing weight. They carried on overeating despite everything that had happened. And he wanted to get to the root of it and think, well, what's going on? And he started to ask those patients questions. And what he realized was that a really high percentage of those patients had told him that when they were younger, they were sexually abused. And he thought, what's going on? What's happening here? And developed a survey called the ACE questionnaire, which the Welsh government are leading the world on. So if you're interested, a guy called Mark Bellis at Bangor University is a world leader in understanding adverse childhood experiences. And sometimes people really misunderstand this and they think it's really deterministic. But the idea is that things happen. So adverse childhood experiences take place. So they could be traumas with a big T, really big things that might have happened to us, or traumas with a small t, or no one was there to help us make sense of it. So we haven't developed those early attachment relationships. And as a result of that, our brains don't develop as well as they should. So we develop social, emotional, cognitive impairments. And as a result of that, we might adopt self-soothing behaviors. So we might eat too much, smoke too much, drink too much. All of those things then lead to disease and disability and social problems. And this study's been replicated now in dozens of countries around the world with hundreds of thousands of people. And we still get the same dose response. So the higher the number of adverse experiences, the greater the likelihood of developing physical, social, and emotional mental health issues later in life, and life expectancy reducing. When I first came across this, I was terrified, actually, because I'd got a number of adverse childhood experiences in my own childhood growing up. My dad died when I was very young. We were really poor. I can remember hiding from the rent man on a Wednesday afternoon when he came around to collect the rent. There was loads of stuff going on. And when I first heard about this, I was really worried, because the bit that they didn't tell me at the time was that protective factors are just as important. So a child might have 4 or 5 ACEs, but a large number of protective factors. And those protective factors are around relationships, rules, routines, ways of doing things, adult behaviors that really impact on a child's life. So a child might have one ACE, one adverse experience, and no protective factors, and that's just as harmful. And when I looked, I did a little bit of research with the school I was working at the time with Tor, and we looked at all of our young people, and there were people right across the spectrum. So we had young people in the PRU, secondary PRU, we had young people in medical tuition, and we did an ACE questionnaire with parents, and we'd do it in a non-intrusive way. So we'd just say, here's a questionnaire, it's just something we do, can you give us a number? Don't tell us what a number means, just give us a number. And most of the time our parents would want to tell us what that number meant, because a lot of them had had their own issues when they were growing up as well as kids, and they developed that wonky narrative, I'm not an okay person, other people are not to be trusted. And we also did a protective factors questionnaire as well. Easy to do in a really small setting, not so easy to do when you work in a secondary school with 1,400 kids. And also thinking about how you might gather this information, because as a parent, what would it feel like to be in a situation where someone is asking you those questions? But when those early childhood experiences take place and we develop that brain architecture that doesn't quite function as well as it should, some young people develop what's called a sensitized stress response. So the amygdala, particularly in the brain, is really sensitive to threat, real or imagined. It's almost like they've got a smoke detector that's constantly going off, and it's really, really sensitive. So you're looking at me funny, what's the matter with you? You push me in the line, you nick my pencil, all of that stuff. The brain and the body have adapted to be trigger happy, because that's what's kept these kids alive. And sometimes it's hard to understand that. And my kids have got cats, and they do this daft thing where they put a cucumber behind a cat. Have you ever done it? It's good fun. And their cat's amygdala codes that cucumber as a snake. So it immediately sees a threat and leaps into the air, sends a message down the brainstem. Whoa, I've got to get out of there really quickly. And then the cat's neocortex comes back online and says, that's just my stupid owner. And I think very often I think about some of the young people I've dealt with over the years who've got that hypersensitized stress response. And we wonder where that came from, because nothing happened and they react in a particular situation. And we think, you've gone from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. What's going on? And I think we're seeing that more and more. I think we're seeing more and more young people with a threat response part of the brain that is seeing threat real or imagined. Another thing that I found really useful over the years is the work of a guy called Jaak Panksepp. So I don't know whether you've heard of him. Jaak Panksepp was an Estonian neuroscientist. He spent 40 years of his life studying the limbic system of mammals in particular. And he discovered 6 distinct systems in the limbic system of the brain. And each one is dependent on a particular neurochemical profile. And we've all got these systems, whether we're a rat or a human being. And he divided them into pro-social systems. So care is your attachment system. Seeking is in a mammal, it's where you find shelter and warmth. And for us, it's how we engage with knowledge in the wider world. Seeking is stimulated by dopamine. So it's the anticipation of reward. And in society today, we are completely bombarded, aren't we, by dopamine and play. And play stimulates those opioids and oxytocins that stimulate the care system. And then the alarm systems in the brain, rage, fear, panic, and grief. So they are fed by those stress hormones. And we need, as human beings, and any mammal needs, a balanced and optimally activated set of pro-social systems and an optimally activated set of alarm states. So if something is really scary, you need to be scared. If something is worth getting angry about and worth getting assertive about, you need to be angry, because all the research shows that people who suppress their alarm states, that leads to mental ill health. So panic and grief is loss and leads to sadness. So some young people who are locked into these alarm states and they have underactivated pro-social systems might be those young people that are just full of rage. They're full of anger. They're angry all the time, or they're afraid and anxious all the time, or they're depressed. And that's where they've got an overactivated rage, an overactivated fear, and an overactivated panic and grief system. And this work really helped me understand some of those young people who were very different in their outward expression of their behavior. So young people in medical tuition who had really overactivated fear systems, they were full of anxiety, or overactivated panic and grief systems, they were really depressed and really sad. Or the kids in the Pru that were full of rage, they're full of anger, because anger serves that purpose. What they all had in common was an underactivation of care, seeking, and play. So in my setting, we worked a lot on stimulating those 3 things. So how do we stimulate the care system? How do we stimulate the attachment system to make young people feel safe enough to go into relationship, to be in a classroom, to learn? And we did that through a lot of relational intervention, a lot of play, a lot of stimulation of the seeking system to dampen down those alarm states, because it's a little bit like a seesaw. So if one lot are overactivated or underactivated, I find this really useful in trying to understand some of those really complex and really problematic young people, and what do they need neurochemically, what do they need to dampen down those alarm states? Because an underactivated care system leads to blocked trust. So these kids don't trust anybody. The world's a really scary place and people can't be trusted, so I'm not going to go anywhere near them. And very often they lack empathy and they lack compassion for themselves particularly, but also for other people. And we sometimes label those young people as, they might be labeled as psychopaths. So we might say they're on the autistic spectrum because they don't get empathy. They don't get it. It's possibly because they've never experienced it. After lockdown, a lot of kids came back. I don't know about you, but a lot of kids came back into my setting with a massively underactivated seeking system. They used to say stuff like, I can't be bothered. I just don't want to do it. I've got no drive. They're really lethargic. They were, in my setting, these kids are really vulnerable to addiction. So because they're not getting their dopamine in healthy ways, they'll get it in really unhealthy ways. And they're really open to manipulation, particularly by county lines gangs. An underactivated play system is kids that can't play with ideas, they can't lose, they can't turn take, they can't share, they can't be spontaneous with other people. And then when we've got an overactivation of rage states, Bruce Perry, who is another person that I really admire, he's a psychiatrist in the States. He was the first guy that was on the scene at the Waco siege. He's written a brilliant book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And he's done a lot of work looking at how states become traits. So the way that we think and feel and behave becomes locked in, it becomes part of our personality. So a child that's locked in anger and rage and violence and aggression, a child that's locked in with anxiety, or a child that's locked in with depression. And, you know, I talked earlier about some of those brain chemicals, and this is not about trying to understand neuroscience. Neuroscience is so complex, you know, and we know so much more about the brain now than we knew 2 years ago. And personally, I'm fascinated by it because it helps me get it. But the really key ones, you know, the pro-social systems are oxytocin, the cuddle hormone, the connection chemical, opioids, dopamine. BDNF is another one. It's like fertilizer for the brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's produced in rough and tumble play and sensory richness. Kids in Sweden, Denmark attend forest school until they're 7. They play, they take chances, they have healthy risk. By the time they're 8, they've outstripped our kids in terms of academic ability because they've had a stimulation of those pro-social chemicals in the brain and a dampening down of those rage chemicals, those panic grief chemicals of cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline. Another interesting one is acetylcholine. So that's the grief chemical. And if grief isn't processed and it isn't acted upon, it can very often turn to rage. So one of the things that I think, again, that we find difficult to understand sometimes is how sometimes unconsciously through what we do and how we do it, we can trigger young people to go into rage, fear, panic and grief. We can trigger them to go into a social defensive position rather than a social engagement position. And there's another interesting piece of research by Stephen Porges called polyvagal theory that I've found fascinating and useful. So he says that we need 2 things to feel safe. One is the absence of the threat, but the other one is human connection. Because as a species, we've evolved to connect with others because we're pretty useless as individuals. We can't protect ourselves. Throughout the course of our evolution, we've sought to connect with other people who are like us and look like us and sound like us because we feel safer with them. And he explored this in terms of what he called neuroception. So your perception, your conscious awareness of what's happening through your main senses happens in about 900 milliseconds. Your neuroception happens in 200 milliseconds. So we get messages through our main sensory organs, but also through our gut and through our heart and through our lungs. And there's a nerve called the vagus nerve, which is like the parasympathetic nervous system's main highway. And it sends information upstairs and downstairs across our body and between us. And we look for danger and look for safety in 3 main channels. Neuroception picks up messages really, really quickly from the face. So my wife describes my face as a face for radio. I've just got one of those faces that just looks like it's in a mood all the time. The kids at Peru used to call it an RBF. I've got an RBF. I've just got one of those faces that just looks like it's moody. And we had a wonderful young woman called Faith, you know, and you have kids that just stick in your mind. And Faith used to come up to me every day and say, "What's the matter with you?" And I'd say, "Well, nothing, Faith. Why?" And she'd say, "Well, tell your face that," and walk off. Because kids who've experienced lots of issues when they were younger, perhaps domestic violence, they haven't had someone to help them make sense of it, their neuroception is wow. They can process threat extremely quickly, and they don't take in the whole face. They just take in the eyes. They take in these little muscles at the corner of the eyes that pull your face up into a genuine smile, and they process that information in 200 milliseconds really, really quickly. And that threat is either real or imagined. The voice is another one. So our tone of voice, particularly the way that we speak. If you're like me and you're from the northwest of England and we've got really flat vocal tones, Sometimes that's experienced as threat. Some young people are tuning in to the sounds of fear that are really high pitched, or the sounds of anger that are really low pitched. And your body as well, your body language, the way you stand, the position of you in space in relation to other young people sends unconscious messages to our neuroception whether something is safe or not. And we're all, every single one of us, constantly scanning the environment for threat. And this piece of work really helped me understand why, and it went alongside with, Panksepp's work. Why do some young people, some teenagers, some children in primary schools, why do they go into a threat response really, really quickly? And it's because their brains and bodies have adapted to living in a scary, unpredictable world. And when they see these faces, the top row of people are very different to the bottom row of people. The bottom row of people are not genuinely smiling. Those little muscles are not being picked up. And they detect that really, really quickly. And they process that as a threat, real or imagined. This is from one of my favorite movies, The Falsest Smile You Can Possibly Imagine. When we give an impression to a young person that we don't want to be with them, we don't want to see them, we don't want to be there, through our face, we might not be thinking that at all. We might just be really, really tired. So thinking about how your face comes across, what signals would this face give to a young person with a sensitized stress response? And if we look at these people here, they don't look happy, do they? Would you go and sit next to these people at a conference and then comparing them to these people here? And we don't focus, as I said, on the whole face. We just concentrate on the eyes and we pick up messages from the eyes. And it's the same with our hearing. Very often young people who've experienced trauma are locked in to those high-pitched sounds, or they're locked into those low-pitched sounds. So the standard advice is to calm someone down, speak really calmly to them. And that doesn't work because they can't hear you. So this piece of research really helped me understand why sometimes we need to match and catch the intensity of where a young person is at. So, if they're up here and they're absolutely in a rage state, then going up there, but the words you use are really calming. Wow, I can see you're really upset. You're really angry with me. I would imagine that's really, really difficult for you, and then bringing them down. Or if they're down here and they're really upset and they're really down, and you go in and you completely miss a tune and get it all wrong by being really bouncy, that is the exact opposite of what happens. And think about crowds, think about lesson change over time. Think about, movement around school. For some young people, that ambiguity of all those different sounds, those different faces, that different body language is an absolute threat response. And very often, some of them will move into a fight response. Some of them will move into a shutdown response. Another really useful model for me is this one. And this comes from the work of John Bailin and Dan Hughes. I'll put the links in the chat. But very often, young people who don't trust us, they've got that sense of, I'm a bad kid, I'm really mean, and I'm not going to go anywhere near you. We had a young woman that came to us called Lily. I'm going to finish in a minute. I know we've not got a lot of time, but she came to us. She'd been in, I think, 4 schools by the time she came to us. And she came to us with an internal dialogue, which was, I'm a bad kid, and I'm going to prove to you how bad I can be. And with Lily, we were, as an organization, we used PACE. We were playful, we were accepting, we were curious, we were empathetic. We didn't accept her behavior, but we were accepting of the emotional state underneath the behavior. And we were really curious. Will you help me understand, Lily, what's going on? And most of all, really empathetic. And what happens is when you behave in that way, there's a good surprise going on in the brain. And Lily came, I think it was about 2 weeks in, she burst into my office, and forgive my language, but she looked at me, put her hands on her hips, and she went, you're just fucking weird. And I said, what do you mean, Lily? Well, you're just weird. What's the matter with you all? And it's because you are behaving in a way that's very different to all the other adults that have ever behaved with them. You don't accept the behavior. We still have to put consequences in place. This is my view, not the only view. But I think we still need consequences. Kids still need to know where the buck stops. They need to know where the boundaries are. But we were absolutely accepting of what was underneath it and really curious. So what then happened is Lily moved to conflict, and this is what happens. So I'm really going to prove to you then, okay, I'm going to step it up. And her behavior became really extreme. She was horrible to other kids. She was horrible to staff. She was particularly vitriolic to me. And this is the hardest bit. So when people see this, they think, well, this relational stuff just isn't working. They're getting worse. I just need to go back to more and more punishment. If you work through that and you keep going, kids get to practice trust over mistrust. So for Lily, what happened is that she started to really tune in and settle Monday to Wednesday. And then Thursday to Friday, her behavior became much more problematic. And we started to think something's going on at the weekend, but she wouldn't tell us what it was. If you keep going, you get to resolving that internal conflict. And for Lily, this happened on her last day. We always did a prom in a Peru. And the girls all bought really nice prom dresses, and the boys brought really lovely tracksuits. And Lily came up to me and another member of staff, and she told us something about her early childhood that she'd never told anybody else, and it involved sexual abuse from an early age. And obviously we got social care involved, and luckily we worked with her through the summer holiday. And we had a young guy, a brilliant youth worker, who went to her FE college with her in September. And when she went to FE, she moved back to practice a little bit, but she very quickly moved back into resolving. And she's now training to be a pediatric nurse. She'll be amazing at it. And the reason she'll be amazing at it is she's gone through this process. And it looks linear, and it isn't. It's messy. You know, kids move up and down and backwards and forwards. But I think my view is that this is one of the most useful models for understanding why some kids just reject praise, why they don't want it, why they don't want you. And, you know, if we think about relational practice, I think relational practice is building relational currency. It's not just about being nice to young people. It's taking the time to notice them when they're brilliant, taking the time to check in with them, thinking about how you meet and greet them in the morning. Meet and greet is the most cost-effective, free thing you can do to build relational currency with young people, because you might be the only safe person they've met all week. Every time you interact with a young person, you intervene and you build relational currency so that you can draw on it when you need it. You know, when you really, really need it, when things have got to the point where it isn't working, building relational currency, I think, is where it's at. The other thing that I think is really useful, and I'm honestly going to finish in a second, is thinking about school rules. And I saw this on the internet recently, and if this is your school, I really apologize. But this was held up by Tom Bennett, the government's behaviour czar, on Twitter as being really, really good practice. And I question this. And the reason I question it is no one can remember all these rules. And a lot of the work that I do when I go into schools is I ask the young people, what are the school rules? And it's always a variation or theme, from wear shiny shoes to don't run down the corridor, or you can't do this, or you can't do that, and you can't do the other. And one of the questions I ask when I go into schools, and I ask them what their rules are. First of all, I ask the staff in training what the school rules are, and none of them can remember them. And then I ask them about a corridor test. So can you use your school rules in a situation in a corridor with a young person? Can you use those rules to teach and reinforce what you want from young people? You know, Sadie's at the end of a corridor. She's kicking 7 bells out of a door. Can you go up to Sadie and co-regulate her and calm her down using one of those? I don't think you can. And I don't think Sadie can remember them either. But one of the things that we do a lot in when the adults change is 3 rules: ready, safe, respect. Whatever they are, you can use those rules to teach behavior. You can use those rules to positively notice and acknowledge kids when they're getting it right and praise them. And, you know, I think one of the things that I think is really useful is trying to get a school to sum up its rules in 3 words. And what are those 3 words, and how can you use them? I just want to finish on shame, actually. because inadvertently, I think in our education profession, we trigger shame on young people. And if we think about, in secondary schools, it's very often ticks on the board. So in my wife's school, they use this. So you've got the positive ticks on the board, and then you've got the negative ticks on the board. And then if you get 3 ticks on the negative side of the board, there's a consequence. And I very often reflect about some of the young people that I've dealt with over the years, and it's either shame or fame. So those kids will either get themselves on the bad side of the board straight away, because I'm going to be on there anyway, so I might as well do it in style, or they get their self-esteem and their kudos from the other kids in the room, and they do it too. And primary schools dress it up sometimes, and they make it really fancy with rain clouds and rainbows and storm clouds and helicopters and pit stops and God knows what else, but it's exactly the same. And one of the questions I often ask staff when I'm working with them is this: if your head teacher put this in the staff notice board and wrote on the names of staff who were outstanding teachers, and then wrote on the names of staff who were good teachers, and then wrote on the names of the staff that were in needs of improvement, how would you feel as an adult? And yet we do that with young people all the time. And I think that leads, in my view, to young people very often escalating their behaviours and triggering that sense of self that is negative. So remove that and do some positive noticing, sticky praise. Praise, not generic praise, but really sticky praise. I can see that was brilliant. That was amazing sitting. Thank you so much. That's fantastic listening, Harry. That is amazing. Thank you so much. What that does is it reinforces that sense of self. So you get into that notion that perhaps I'm all right, I am, and I don't need to be that kid. I had loads more that I was going to share with you, but I know I don't have time. But I hope that stimulated your thinking, and be really happy to be challenged by any of that and take any questions. But they are for me, the main theoretical perspectives that have given me a view of how I've worked over the years with young people, and particularly those that really challenge us.